A second Trump presidency could cost Canada tens of billions of dollars a year. That's a stark warning from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. The newest report looks at one of Trump's major promises, a 10% tariff on all imports coming into the United States. It is meant to protect U.S. jobs and support their domestic economy, but this study says it could cost the U.S. around $171 billion per year. And Canada's economy could take a $30 billion hit each year. The report flags Alberta oil, Ontario's auto manufacturing sectors as the two sectors most at risk. Trevor Tombe is an economics professor at the University of Calgary and is the author of this report. Trevor Tombe, it's good to have you back on the show. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So the 10% tariff, $30 billion cost per year, that's the economic impact on Canada. $30 billion is a big number, but the economy's big. It's $2 trillion plus. So help us understand the scope and scale of $30 billion. What does that compare to in terms of the hit?
Well, on, say, a per-person basis, that represents several $100s per person in Canada. At the high end here, if we have both a 10% tariff levied by the U.S. and retaliated with Canada levying its own 10% tariff, the cost per person rise to about $1,100 per year. So it's quite large, both in terms of aggregate numbers for the economy as a whole, but also for real individuals. And those costs are from all sorts of different sources: job losses and disruption in manufacturing, higher prices as well, which means our incomes can purchase fewer goods and services than they did before, adding to that affordability challenge that we're still working through right now. So very substantial consequences of disrupting the Canada-U.S. trade relationship.
Okay, you talked about two sets of tariffs there. There's the 10% that Trump is promising as a core, I'm going to say, economic policy, though I'm not really sure how I would characterize it. And that's the $30 billion cost. But then you mentioned a retaliatory tariff from Canada, which does seem inevitable, because that's what we saw when Trump did this on target areas such as steel in his presidency. So what does the 10% tariff do to the overall hit, that $30 billion, it gross?
Well, if the U.S. levies a 10% tariff across the board on everything, this would be something that other countries would respond to. We wouldn't just have it sit there as though it's not violating all sorts of trade agreements. And so we would retaliate, as is the normal course when a country does engage in this, as we saw, as you mentioned, with steel and aluminum. So if we retaliate, and if other countries retaliate with across-the-board tariffs of our own against exports from the United States being imported into their countries, then the costs just grow. Now, that might sound counterproductive. You mentioned the $30 billion. If the U.S. just levies its own tariff, that grows to $45 billion in costs for Canada if we match it. But importantly, the consequences in the U.S. also grow. I estimate in the report for the Canadian Chamber here that the U.S. economy shrinks by about 0.5 to 0.6% if they levy just their own tariffs. But that rises to a reduction in their economy by about 1%, so roughly double the costs on them if we retaliate. So these retaliations are meant to raise the costs of the U.S. policy decision to levy the tariff in the first place, acting as kind of a deterrent, although I guess we'll see.
All of this sounds like a recipe for a recession. I mean, is that the sort of thing you see coming out of this? Because you talk about these orders of magnitude as percentages, and this is not like temporary circumstances necessarily. This would presumably be there for the duration of a Trump presidency, should he win. I mean, does this put us into negative growth, as they say?
It almost surely would. Now, these estimates of Canada's economy shrinking, productivity falling by 1.5 to 1.6%, that's the permanent effect of the 10% tariff. There'd be a lot of short-run disruptions because businesses would need to find new suppliers, new customers, try and change the way they do things. Companies that operate on both sides of the border share these long and complicated supply chains where goods are moving back and forth, and they'd have to figure out how to do things differently. And investment in lots of sectors, motor vehicles, transport equipment in general, the energy sector, that investment would likely pause for some time as we figure out the new rules of the game. And so the short-term costs of this measure would be quite a bit larger and almost surely a recession.
Right. I mean, there are some companies and some industries that could look to Europe, look to Asia to find other markets or other supply chains, but nothing really kind of beats the convenience and the scale of the United States, right? And you talked about a couple of sectors there, Trevor, energy and auto. They're going to get hammered by something like this. I mean, the impact in those sectors in particular, which are vital to the Canadian economy, is going to be enormous.
That's right. So I estimate here for motor vehicles in particular that in this scenario where the US levies its 10% tariff and the world retaliates with similar measures, motor vehicle exports to the US would drop by the equivalent of about 1/5 of that sector's total output. So a considerable hit to production there. You're right to note, of course, they would look out for other suppliers and other customers. That would take time and wouldn't be as attractive an opportunity as currently exists in the US. But it's not just Canadian companies here. The US companies would face similar disruptions in motor vehicles as well. These are integrated companies on both sides of the border. We estimate that about 12 cents of every dollar exported from Canada to the US actually originated in the US to begin with. A parts manufacturer there, for example, sending it up to Canada for some further processing, and then it's sent back. And if you strip out oil and gas as well, the US has a trade surplus. It's fairly stable and consistent over time with Canada. And so I think there's just a lot of broad misunderstanding about the trade relationship between Canada and the US by some policymakers in the US.
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment. The 1/5 impact you talked about on the output of the auto sector, basically, 20% of the wealth, 20% of the value that industry currently creates is gone, wiped out if this tariff war becomes a reality.
And that would involve a lot of adjustment costs for businesses, of course, needing to change where they're putting their investment dollars or putting them anywhere at all. It would also likely mean reductions in employment in those sectors, and so adjustment costs on individuals seeking out different opportunities in different sectors. And those are the potentially very large short-term consequences of this measure that are not really even fully captured in that 20% reduction that I just noted.
So, when you look at this, we're focusing obviously specifically on the impact on this side of the border, but as you've pointed out, it has a significant consequential effect on what happens in the United States. It all sounds like an argument not to do it, Trevor Tombe, and I know that's what the Canadian government is trying to do through this Team Canada approach. I mean, what's your sense of whether a fact-based, data-driven argument could persuade President Trump and his administration and a second administration? Because this is at the center of what they want to do.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I certainly won't pretend to be in the mind of former President Trump or anyone on his team. But it's not unusual in politics for certain policy measures to be taken up or policy positions to be taken that are not perfectly aligned with evidence or facts or a real understanding of the consequences of the measures, because sometimes it's just about signaling. And I think that's what this is about in the United States, where former President Trump uses policies like this, which are way beyond what other candidates are putting forward, as a way to signal to a certain type of voter who feels that international trade has disadvantaged them. And to be clear, there are winners and losers from international trade, but he's using that to signal that he's on their side and he's going to do big things to try and help them, even though a measure like this would not be something that on the whole would be beneficial to the American economy.
His central political argument, just as a final point, has been that these tariffs will be good for America. They will make money from these. And that's just not how it plays out in reality when you do the modeling, right?
Exactly. So that's not right. Tariffs, for the most part, especially when there's retaliation by others, will increase prices. That's certainly the short-term implication of them, and they lower productivity, which lowers incomes in the longer run. So think about energy. We export a considerable amount of oil to the United States, a lot to the Midwest, and a lot of this tariff might be borne by refineries in the Midwest, leading to higher gasoline prices. And so consumers will feel it, even if they don't realize the prices are higher for this reason. They're ultimately bearing the burden of the tariff.
Trevor Tombe, economics professor at the University of Calgary. Always appreciate it, sir. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.